ਬੇਨਤੀ ਕਰਦਾ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਗੁਰਨਾਮ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ, ਜਿੱਥੇ ਆਪਣਾ ਪਰਸਪੈਕਟਿਵ ਵੀ ਦੱਸਣ, ਉੱਥੇ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਇਸ ਪੂਰੇ ਇਵੈਂਟ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਕੀ ਨਿਕਲਦਾ ਹੈ ਸਿੱਖ ਡਾਇਸਪੋਰਾ ਲਈ, ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਇਸ ਸਟਰਗਲ ਨੂੰ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾਣਾ, ਇਸ ਅਵੇਅਰਨੈਸ ਨੂੰ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾਣਾ ਹੈ। ਡਾਕਟਰ ਗੁਰਨਾਮ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ।
ਹਾਂਜੀ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਮਨਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਸੱਦਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਔਰ ਮੇਰੇ ਚੰਗੇ ਭਾਗ ਗਿਆ ਵੀ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਮੰਚ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਝ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਆਪਣੇ ਵੀ ਪੇਸ਼ ਕਰਨ ਵਾਸਤੇ। ਸੋ ਮੇਰਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਟਾਸਕ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਸਾਰੀ ਸਮਿੰਗ ਅਪ ਕਰਨੀ, ਮੇਰਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਹਰੇਕ ਬੁਲਾਰੇ ਨੇ ਜੋ ਗੱਲ ਕਹੀ ਉਹ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਸਮਿੰਗ ਅਪ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਵਧੀਆ ਖੂਬਸੂਰਤ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਐਂਗਲਸ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਆ। ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਟਰਗਲਸ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕਈ ਪੱਖ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ। ਆਮ ਸਟਰਗਲ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ, ਫੋਰਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਵੀ, ਵਿਚਾਰ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਵੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ, ਲੀਗਲ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਆ, ਮੋਰਲੀ ਵੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਆ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਹਰੇਕ ਇਨਸਾਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਮੋਰਲ ਬੇਸਿਸ ਵੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ, ਹੈ ਨਾ। ਠੀਕ ਆ, ਕੋਈ ਬਾਹਲੇ ਪਾਪ ਕਰਦਾ, ਕੋਈ ਘੱਟ ਪਾਪ ਕਰਦਾ, ਕੋਈ ਨਹੀਂ ਵੀ ਪਾਪ ਕਰਦਾ, ਪਰ ਹਰੇਕ ਮਨੁੱਖ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਸੁਰਤੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੋਲਦੀ ਆ। ਬੇਸ਼ੱਕ ਪਾਪੀ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਪਾਪ ਚੁੱਭਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ। ਸੋ ਇਹ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਢੰਗ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ। ਤਾਂ ਕਈ ਵਾਰੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ 'ਚ ਸਾਡੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹਿ ਆਦਤ ਵੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੱਕੋ ਹੀ ਢੰਗ ਨੂੰ ਫੜ ਲੈਂਦੇ, ਜੀ ਡਾਂਗ ਚੱਕ ਲਓ, ਜਿਹਨੇ ਡਾਂਗ ਨਹੀਂ ਚੱਕੀ ਉਹ ਗਦਾ ਰਿਹਾ। ਤਾਂ ਦੂਜੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਵਿਦਵਾਨ ਕਹਿ ਦਿਓ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਕਿਸੇ ਜਜ਼ਬਾਤ ਨੂੰ ਹੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਜਜ਼ਬਾਤ ਹੀ ਮਾੜੀ ਆ। ਹਾਂਜੀ, ਸੋ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਭ ਕੁਛ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਤਾਂ ਮੇਰਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਮੇਰੇ ਜਿੰਨੇ ਵੀ ਬੁਲਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਦਿੱਤੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਟ ਐਂਗਲਸ ਦੇ ਦਿੱਤੀਆਂ। ਮੈਂ ਹੈ ਨਾ ਥੋੜ੍ਹੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨੀ ਹੈ, ਅਤੇ ਰੀਜ਼ਨ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਵੀ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਤਾਂ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਹੀ ਆ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਨੂੰ, ਘਰਾਂ 'ਚ ਵੀ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਆ, ਇੱਥੇ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰੇ ਵੀ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਜੋ ਸਾਡੇ ਦੁਸ਼ਮਣ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਹੋਣਗੇ। ਮੇਰਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਜੇ ਉਹ ਆਪਣਾ ਕੰਮ ਸਹੀ ਕਰਦੇ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਦੇਖਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਅਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਬਿਆਨ ਹੋਣਾ, ਆਮ ਗੋਇੰ ਟੂ ਸਪੀਕ ਟੂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਜੇਲਰ ਆ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕੈਦੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੰਦੀ ਰੱਖਿਆ ਆ, ਉਹ ਸਰਕਾਰ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਡਾਇਰੈਕਟਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨੀ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ। ਸੋ ਮੇਰਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਜੇ ਮੈਂ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੋਲਦਾ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸੌਖੀ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਤਾ ਉਹ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਸਮਝਦੇ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਮਝਦੇ। ਸੋ ਆਈਡ ਲਾਈਕ ਟੂ ਟਾਕ ਡਾਇਰੈਕਟਲੀ ਟੂ ਦੋਜ਼ ਹੂ work within the Indian state. Ranjit Singh said something very important just before me. He's a lawyer. He said that in 1984, the Indian state declared a war against the Sikhs. And therefore, the Sikhs, to defend themselves, were using international law. The right of defense, self-defense, is no offense. The Sikhs never wanted to claim your territories. All we wanted to do was to live in peace and to have some basic rights. If you recall the Anandpur Sahib da Mata, it was only asking for the basic rights that the states within America, the individual states, have more rights than the rights that Sikhs were asking for in Anandpur da Mata. We were asking for justice, and you labelled us as secessionists. And then you declared war, and then you sent in the armed forces, and the Sikhs did what is legally right. And the Geneva Convention, Ranjit Singh talked about they are prisoners of war. Absolutely they are prisoners of war. And I know that you will argue that they were not fighting for a separate state, so how could they be prisoners of war? And I'd like to bring to your attention the Good Friday Agreement that ended the conflict in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, which was seen by the British state as an integral part of the British state, and there'd been a conflict. And in 1998, and don't forget, the IRA who was fighting for the reunification of Ireland, who didn't accept the British state, were also responsible for blowing up Lord Mountbatten, who was the uncle, I think, of the Queen, and many other so-called, well, atrocities. Yeah, they blew bombs, Manchester bombing, etc. But what you did in that agreement, you agreed to release those prisoners. You agreed a general amnesty. And you accepted them as political prisoners. De facto, the Good Friday Agreement accepted that the conflict in Ireland was in effect a war, and that the peace was won by releasing those prisoners. So I appeal to you, मैं ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ अपील करदा जे तुसी शांति चाਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੇਸ਼ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਕਦੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੇਸ਼ ਪਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਹੱਕ ਦਿਓ ਸਾਡੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਇੰਟਰਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਕਨਵੈਨਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆ ਪਰ ਉਸ ਸਟੇਟ ਨੇ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਇਟਸ ਨਾਟ ਕੈਪੇਬਲ ਬਿਕਾਜ਼ according to the World Press Freedom Index 2021, this is an independent organisation, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ India ranks 140th in that league table. 140 number there. And this state claims to be the world's biggest democracy, yet it's 140th. In fact, there are dictatorships that are higher up in that World Press report than India. Let me go on record. I support Indian democracy. मैं चाहता इंडिया दे विच democracy होवे कौन नहीं चाहता मेरे ख्याल हरेक सिख चाहता क्योंकि असी democratic right दविंदरजीत ने गल की दविंदरजीत said why is it a crime to ask for your own self-determination? It's in the UN resolution. If the Scots can ask for a referendum to decide their future, so why, if the Sikhs ask for that, they are terrorists? You are claimed to be the world's biggest democracy. So you need to answer that questions. Now, often you say every 4 years, 5 years, we have an election. And we have these millions of people voting. But democracies are not only about elections. In Ukraine, we've just had an election. We've had a so-called referendum in parts of Ukraine that have been annexed by the Russians. But do we accept that as democratic? We don't. But what happens in and between the elections also matters. And in that regard, India is in a really dire strait. In a recent debate by the Asian Society at the University of Oxford, it's a recent, you can, everything I'm saying to you, by the way, I'm not just making things up. You can look these things up. I can give you the references. One of the speakers, one of the debaters there, the French political scientist who specializes in South Asia and India, has written extensively, Christophe Jafflot. This is what he said about Indian democracy, and I quote, he said, the ruling BJP, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is far richer than the other parties. So that's one reason why democracy can't prevail, if the ruling party has all the material support. But he said the media coverage favours the Prime Minister, and the opposition leaders face intimidation and imprisonment. The Indian Parliament has lost significance as laws are often passed without debate. Judges are blackmailed or not appointed at all if they refuse to be influenced, meaning the only independent judiciary mostly rules in favour of the government. Universities too are losing their independence because the government puts men in charge of them who are directly linked to the state. Stricter financing laws have led to the disappearance of 2/3 of India's NGOs over the past 7 years. Let me repeat that. The government's policies have meant that 2/3 of the non-governmental organizations who are active in India, often in civil society, protecting the rights of those who the state had failed, they've left India. And just a week ago, there was a vote in the UN condemning the Russians for annexing the Ukraine and organizing those fake referendum. Naturally, Russia voted against, they did a veto. And 10 countries voted for the resolution to condemn Russia. But 4 countries abstained, of which India was one of them. So this is the world's greatest democracy that refuses to condemn the actions of Putin. China and Brazil and Gabon were the others that abstained. And so I hope that ministers of the Indian state are watching this program And for some twisted logic, they show little regard for human rights, especially the rights of Sikh political prisoners. And I want to have a conversation with them. You know, I'm not going to blame the Indian state. I'll tell you why. Because the state doesn't have eyes. The state doesn't have ears. State is just an abstract concept. It's the people who operate the machinery of the state. It's the ministers, it's the politicians, civil servants, and it's the judges. It's those people who exercise the power on behalf of the state. They have ears. So I appeal to you. I'm sure that most of those individuals who operate the Indian state, they have families, they have aspirations, they have dreams for their own families. And I'm sure they teach their children morality, you know, basic rules of justice and fairness. And that they might even believe that they are defenders of democratic values. So I want to appeal to you on a very humane level, as a human being, because I believe even though you are in that state, even though you pass resolutions and policies that deny people basic human rights, I still believe somewhere in your heart, thode dilan de vich koi na koi morality hegi hai. So I want to appeal to you on a human level. I want to impress upon you that by continuing to cause the suffering, the immense suffering which you've heard about today, of the Sikh political prisoners, but not just them, their families and their friends. Not only are you denying them their human rights, the human rights of others, ultimately you are denying yourself the capacity to be a fully human person. You are tearing away from your own heart your capacity to be compassionate. And this will come back to haunt you. This will come back to destroy you, your families, and your nation that you love so much. If you love India, then you should be fighting for democracy in India, not the denial of... If you love India, if you respect Indian democracy, then you should be fighting for the release of those political prisoners who did nothing but self-defense. And I'd like to reflect on the words of a very famous, in fact, probably the most famous historically political prisoner of conscience, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who in his own words talks about the experience of being a political prisoner. Now this is really interesting, he was a decorated commander in the Soviet army. He fought in the Second World War, but he saw some terrible atrocities that were being committed by the Soviet soldiers in Germany, of raping, of looting. And he spoke out against that. He criticized that. And for that, Stalin sent him to the Gulag, which was this prison system that was developed where people went and disappeared. It was a system where they were given harsh punishment. And in his years in prison, Solzhenitsyn, he didn't lose his humanity. And he, in fact, wrote lots of books. And he said something very important. He drove out a really important insight into evil in humanity. He says, he served in the Red Army, and he witnessed war crimes, so he knew what suffering was about. And he wrote, he says, you know very well that we've come to Germany to take revenge. He said the non-combatants, the elderly, were robbed of their possessions, women and girls were raped. You know, there are resonances with that and what happened in Delhi in November. What happened even in June 84? That these combatants that were sent were not interested in justice, but rape and pillage. His conscience on seeing these terrible crimes committed against innocent people led him to criticize the Soviet leaders. And as I said, he was sent to prison simply because he criticized them, yet he fought in the war. Sikhs, you talk about Indian independence, Indian sovereignty. Who gave you that sovereignty? ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕਿਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਾਨਾਂ ਵਾਰੀਆਂ ਸੀਗੀਆਂ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਲੈਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਔਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪ ਵਾਅਦੇ ਕੀਤੇ ਸੀ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਦਾ ਨਿੱਘ ਮਾਣਨ ਦੇਵੋਗੇ. You promised them, your great leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, on record said, we will reward the Sikhs, but what did you reward them with? You've divided their Punjab over and over again. You've stolen the river waters. You've poisoned the land. You've imprisoned the youth. And you've spread drugs in the state, to the point where now the parents of those youth are saying, leave the country. This is the reward that you've given, and this is the reason why those Sikhs decided to take on other means. Solzhenitsyn goes on to say, since I have come to understand the truth in this world, this is a struggle of good against evil. But everybody has within them goodness. So I appeal to you, ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਪਾਪਾਂ ਵੱਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਰਸਤਾ ਫੜਿਆ ਆ ਜਾਂ ਨਾ ਹਟੇ ਨਾ, ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅੱਗ ਲਾਉਂਦੇ ਆ ਨਾ, ਸਾੜਦੇ ਆ, ਇਹ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸੜ ਜਾਓਗੇ. And history tells you that. ਮਨਪ੍ਰੀਤ, Soviet Union, ਉਹੀ Soviet Union ਸੀਗੀ, ਸਟਾਲਿਨ ਦੀ Soviet Union, ਜਿਹਨੇ ਸੋਲਜ਼ਨਿਟਸਕਿਨ ਨੂੰ ਜੇਲ੍ਹ 'ਚ ਭੇਜਿਆ ਸੀ. ਅੱਜ ਉਹ Soviet Union ਖਤਮ ਹੋ ਗਈ. The rump of that Soviet Union, the Russian state, is fighting a war, an illegal war, and it's losing. The world is against them. So ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਨਾ ਸੋਚੋ ਵੀ ਖਰਿਆ ਸਾਰੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਖੜੀ ਹੋਗੀ. The world is interested in their own things. I'm just going to finish on one other thing. To hold somebody in prison for what are essentially political crimes indefinitely is perhaps the greatest crime one can commit. Why? In fact, it's even greater than executing somebody. Because when you are in prison and you know you're never going to be released, then you are dying every day. Every day is a death. At least when you get executed, and then you're gone. Just to finish, Howard Zinn, a very famous American historian, playwright, and philosopher who also fought in the Second World War, he talked about imprisonment. He said, I'm convinced that imprisonment is a way of pretending to solve the problem of crime. Because this is the defense of the Indian state, that if we release these prisoners, they will then organize an armed insurrection, that ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਬੰਬ ਚਲਾਉਣ ਲੱਗ ਪੈਣੇ ਆ. Well, actually, the evidence is quite the opposite. In fact, ਜਿਹੜੇ release ਕੀਤੇ ਆ, they're actually doing amazing social services and organizing society against social evils. So this is Howard Zinn said. He says, I'm convinced that imprisonment is only a way to pretend to solve the problem of a crime. It does nothing for the victims of crime, but perhaps perpetuates the idea of retribution, which maintains an endless cycle of violence. So ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਯੋਧਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਜੇਲ੍ਹਾਂ 'ਚ ਰੱਖੋਗੇ ਜੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਹੱਕ ਨਾ ਦਿਓਗੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ. We've got two choices. ਜਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੁਲਾਮ ਹੋ ਜਾਈਏ ਤਾਂ ਜਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਹੱਕਾਂ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਲੜੂਗੇ. ਦੋ ਹੀ ਰਾਹ ਹੈਗੇ. ਔਰ ਸਿੱਖ ਕੌਮ ਦੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਪੜ੍ਹੋ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੀ. ਸਿੱਖ ਕਦੇ ਵੀ ਗੁਲਾਮੀ ਨੂੰ ਨਹੀਂ ਪ੍ਰਵਾਨ ਕਰਦੇ. ਬੇਸ਼ੱਕ ਥੋੜ੍ਹੇ ਰਹਿ ਜਾਈਏ, ਅਸੀਂ ਗੁਲਾਮੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਪ੍ਰਵਾਨ ਕਰਦੇ. ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਜੇ ਇੰਦਰਾ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਨੇ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਪੜ੍ਹੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਨਾ, 84 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦਰਬਾਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ 'ਤੇ ਨਾ ਹਮਲਾ ਕਰਦੀ. Look at the damage that this war that you committed against the Sikhs has caused your state for the last 40 years. Look at the damage it's causing to your reputation across the world. So I want you to be democratic. I want you to give the right. It is a cruel, useless substitute for the elimination of the conditions that you are trying to protect, of homelessness, of desperation, which are the roots of most punished crime. The crimes of the rich and the powerful never go punished. It must surely be the tribute to the resilience of the human spirit that even a small number of those men and women in the hell of the prison system survive it and hold on to their humanity. By Jagtar Singh Hawara or ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਸਾਥੀ. They are the true human beings. ਅਸਲੀ ਮਨੁੱਖ ਆ. ਅਸਲੀ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਡੈਮੋਕ੍ਰੇਸੀ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਸਿੱਖਣਾ, ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਹਿਊਮੈਨਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਸਿੱਖਣਾ ਨਾ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਵੱਲ ਦੇਖੋ. 30-40 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜੇਲ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਆਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਰਿਲੀਜ਼ ਦੀ, ਪਰ ਫਿਰ ਵੀ ਖੇੜੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਚਿਹਰੇ ਖਿੜਦੇ ਆ, ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਆ ਉਹ. ਔਰ ਜੇਲ੍ਹ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਦੂਜੇ ਪ੍ਰਿਜ਼ਨਰ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਚੰਗੇ ਰਾਹ ਪਾਉਂਦੇ ਆ. ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕੈਦੀ ਆ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਲਾਮ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ. If you want to save your country, if you want to save Indian democracy, then please, please try to live up to the principles that you say that you uphold. And I can't appeal to the state. ਮੈਂ state ਨੂੰ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਬੋਲੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ state, ਪਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ operatives ਹੈਗੇ, ਮੈਂ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਮੇਰੀ ਜੋ speech ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਸਾਡੀ conference, ਤੁਸੀਂ share ਕਰੋ ਤੁਹਾਡੀਆਂ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਡਿਪਾਰਟਮੈਂਟਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਸੈਂਸ ਨਾ ਕਰਿਓ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸ਼ੇਅਰ ਕਰਿਓ। ਜੇ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਫੇਰ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਚੰਗੀ ਲੱਗਦਾ, ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਵਿਰਕ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਨੇ, ਡਾਕਟਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਜੇਲ੍ਹਾਂ 'ਚ ਪਾ ਦਿਓ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਫਰਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗਾ। ਬੋਲਦਿਆਂ ਤਾਂ ਭੁੱਲ ਚੁੱਕ, ਮਾਫ਼ ਕਰੋ ਜੀ। ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।